And so I was also in a car crash, and that was devastating. Mentally, it really took me out. So when I think about trauma, it's not necessarily what happens.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this week's episode on Take a Pain Check. I'm so excited to talk to Stacey today. Today's guest is an advocate for mental health support for individuals dealing with chronic illness, pain, and disability. Stacey utilizes her professional education and experience as a registered social worker, combined with her personal experience with vasculitis and Crohn's disease, to write the book Navigating Your Vasculitis Journey, which supports and empowers patients living with vasculitis. Stacey, I'm excited to have you here today on Take a Pain Check. Can you start off by telling me a little bit about yourself, your background, your education, what you're up to professionally, and sort of what your interests are outside of work?
Thanks, Natasha. I'm so happy to be here. So I am a registered social worker, like you mentioned, and I'm a psychotherapist in private practice. Uh, my career was kind of part of healing from my illness. I realized the connection between my own mental health, and how I was coping with my illness. And so that's kind of what brought me to the field and what I'm really passionate about doing in my work. But outside of that, I also am married. I have two kids, an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old. Um, and we travel a lot. And I love hiking and spending time walking my dog and chatting with my neighbors, um, and just like meeting up with friends. So, not everything revolves around my illness, not everything revolves around my work, and not everything revolves around my kids. I think it's so important to have balance.
Thanks so much for sharing that. So you're on this podcast because you also live with a rheumatic disease. Can you tell me a little bit about your diagnosis story? Like what happened, how old you were, and what those early years were like?
Yeah, so my diagnosis story kind of starts when I was about 12. Um, And I had some really random inflammation symptoms happening. To begin with, my asthma that I'd had since I was a little kid, it got much worse. I got some random food allergies, like to kiwi, like really weird things. And then I was having inflammation of my hands, the tops of my hands and my feet, that I found really bothersome because I was a figure skater and I couldn't even get my foot in my boot sometimes to go skate. Um, and during that period of time, it was really hard to get the medical providers to listen and like to identify and treat what was going on. In fact, it would be like 5 years before I got a diagnosis of what was happening with my body. During that time, I developed more symptoms. When I was 14, I got GI symptoms and was diagnosed with like an undifferentiated colitis. They couldn't really understand which one. But all those symptoms that go with Crohn's and colitis, I experienced those my first year of high school and all the way through. And then as I got older, there was also other random inflammation systemically that just weren't explained completely by inflammatory bowel disease. So I had random inflammation of my eyes, and one that was really like difficult. It was life-threatening. I had pericarditis, which is a inflammation of the lining around the heart. I had to have a major intervention at Sick Kids. That's when I actually got connected to care there and started to get a bit more answers and more appropriate care. But I didn't get a diagnosis till I was in grade 12. I needed to be admitted. I was stayed in the hospital for about 6 weeks and had a lung biopsy. And at that point, I finally was diagnosed with EGPA, which is a form of vasculitis, and it's quite uncommon in youth. But yeah, the diagnosis really helped because I got proper treatment. And then I also was able to access accommodations. And we're going to talk about that more later, but I think they're really important.
During that time, like when you were getting that diagnosis, what was going on in your mind and the people around you? Like, what were their reactions to this diagnosis?
I think at that point that we actually got a diagnosis, I'd been hospitalized for 6 weeks, like I mentioned. So we just wanted an answer, any answer at that point. I'd been quite sick at different points, and nothing was really adding up. So there was relief in the diagnosis, but it was also really rare. Um, there wasn't as much of a patient network, or I wasn't aware of it at that age. Yes, we had the internet, but it wasn't the way it is now. Um, and so I felt kind of isolated. It was hard being a young person going through that whole thing, seeing my parents really stressed out. I'm a farm kid, so they didn't get like paid time off. They still were trying to balance the demands of work. It's a 7 day a week job, and the hospital was really far from our home, so there was just so much caught up in that. It was a hard time.
I know that it must have been a lot, especially being a young person and being diagnosed with this rare invisible illness. What do you wish people understood at that age about this disease?
I think some of the struggles I had were from people not really getting it. And I still kind of face that. People think, okay, you've been sick, now you've got treatment, so you should be all better. And in many ways, I'm mostly better and I function quite well. I'm happy to be in remission again. Uh, but there's still days where I'll wake up with pain. Fatigue can show up at any time. And, there's a lot of work that goes into caring for myself just on a daily basis, even when I'm in remission. And especially as a teenager, I really didn't have the words to explain that to my friends or to teachers. Some teachers were awesome. And others, I felt a lot of shame about this amount of school I missed. And I don't know. I kind of wish I could go back and be like, hey, this is what I needed. But I'm able to do that for my clients, and I appreciate that position that I'm able to be in now. So,
Can you talk a little bit about how that support has evolved ever since then? Because I know you were diagnosed when you were younger, and as you grow older, you meet new people, and do you find that it's much easier to navigate your disease now? Like, how has that changed from the past?
yeah. So I think there's a lot that comes with maturity, but also having more confidence just in myself, and in that my needs are allowed to exist, even if they're different from other people's. Coming to that understanding didn't happen till like a couple of years ago, quite frankly. Um, and so I'm much better able to state what is going to help me, what is going to be harder for me. I can opt out of things without as much guilt. But even looking back to going to university, that's when I first was able to access accommodations for my illness with academics. Um, that was such a dramatic change for me. That allowed me to have so much less stress and anxiety. And I think that's what allowed me to get some remission, quite frankly. So, yeah.
And what was your medication journey like? Because living with a rheumatic disease, I know especially vasculitis, like it's definitely like I mean when I've talked to a lot of vasculitis patients, it's quite different from the other rheumatic diseases and every single disease is very different. So what was the treatment like and how has that even evolved now?
Yeah, so 25 years ago, and even now, high dose steroids are first line, and all the side effects that come with it. I didn't get a lot of support around managing side effects. I wish I got more information. I wish people were more honest about how it would impact me and what could be done to support me through that. Um, and then immune suppressant drugs, we didn't have biologics 25 years ago. So I was trialed on Imuran in order to decrease the prednisone. Uh, but I had a negative reaction to that. I got pancreatitis, which is actually quite severe. So that one was out. So then I was trialed on methotrexate. And that is what allowed me to go into remission and get off steroids that time. And I was able to be stable on that for a while. And then they needed to stop that medication due to an autoimmune liver condition I also have that we discovered. So then I was in unmedicated remission from about 20 till mid 30s. So I did have a long period that was pretty stable. And that's when I had my kids. And yeah, I did appreciate that I didn't have to have those medicines. But now I'm managed on low dose prednisone, and it's not so bad.
That's great to hear. What were your symptoms like growing up?
So when I was going like in between flares and things like that, so asthma symptoms, which I still sometimes deal with, heat exacerbates it. I have a lot of different allergies, so that can exacerbate it. I think that's kind of unique with EGPA rather than GPA or some of the other vasculitises. Yeah, with EGPA, we just have a lot more allergies and like upper respiratory stuff. Uh, and then we also have the heart and lungs situation that can happen too. Other things I've experienced, as I got older and when I came out of remission was flares of my GI tract at different times, and it usually goes hand in hand with other systemic inflammation. So I also experienced pyoderma, which is like a skin inflammation. It's pretty serious with like ulcers and things like that. And that was my last flare. And it was hard. I had to get wound care, high dose steroids again, and just really looking for what was going to help it. I was on really high dose steroids for like over 6 months, and that was brutal.
It's very interesting to me that, you were on medication and then also off medication. You're able to kind of stabilize your disease
Yeah.
management. Were there other things you were doing in addition to medication that kind of help with lifestyle? Like, is there really anything you can do for vasculitis lifestyle related?
I noticed that when I'm able to follow like a regular eating schedule, that helps me with my fatigue. I also need to really focus on hydration. I'm not sure if everyone else has to, but with my GI symptoms, that's something that really impacts my fatigue. If I get dehydrated, it happens so quickly. Um, I need movement, and not everyone's the same. And I feel really lucky that I'm in a phase where I can get the movement that helps me to feel good. So I like to walk every day. I like to go for like a big hike on the weekend if the weather cooperates. Um, I was a figure skater, so I was into like sports and everything like that. So I like being able to manage anxiety, but also just like move my body and have less pain by using regular movement. I've also went to physio. I think it's so underrated. It can help a lot. And I don't follow any particular dietary recommendations aside from like the Mediterranean diet, trying to get more lean proteins and vegetables and fruits and things like that.
I think also a big part of living with a disease in general or condition is that it's not just like the physical aspect of it. A lot of it is also emotional and, feeling isolated, anxious, depressed. Like there's a lot of mental toll that can come with this condition that oftentimes we don't talk about in these spaces. And I'm sure in the past it would have been even less talked about. At what point did you realize that managing a chronic illness wasn't just physical, but also deeply emotional?
I think for me, I didn't have the words for it in high school of what I was really feeling or dealing with, but it was that chronic anxiety, um, a lot of perfectionism showing up and feeling a lot of shame around like missing school, like I said, and not having the supports to put words around it or understand why I felt that way. In university, being able to access academic accommodations, it really took the stress off. And that's when I first noticed that, oh, my symptoms are directly related to how much stress I'm experiencing day to day. And maybe some people would disagree with that, but for me, I see it. I also noticed it dramatically after having kids. I don't think I slept properly for about 5 or 6 years. And then that's when I did get my flare, was that lack of sleep, like persistent lack of sleep over multiple years, the stress that puts on the body, and the lack of sleep then also kind of showing up with medications. So for me, when I'm on high dose steroids, I get a lot of insomnia symptoms. Um, and it wasn't till this last flare where I actually got support for that from the doctors who actually said, "Oh yeah, this is something we can treat." Um, that was so helpful. And then therapy. So I engaged in therapy after undergrad. I took a couple of years off. I worked at Starbucks. I was supporting my family through a really stressful situation, and I engaged with therapy. And then I was like, "Oh, this is so important. I didn't realize it." And that was some coping skills and emotion literacy. And it was just like the bare bones, but it helped me so much. And that's why I decided to pursue social work, and work in this field.
Oftentimes people don't even look at sleep as one of the factors that can kind of, make a really big difference in like your pain, your stiffness, and just your life in general. And
Yes.
the emotional aspect, like there is a lot, and you've been pretty open about, PTSD and being diagnosed with PTSD. Can you share a little bit about what that was like and sort of the medical trauma that came with this disease?
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question. Um, so the PTSD happened, like I got my diagnosis later. I think there was always a high level of anxiety, but not, I didn't experience panic. And for me, that's a real hallmark of what my PTSD looks like is having panic attacks. And that happened, as people living with chronic illness. Yes, we deal with the illness, we deal with all different life events. And so I was also in a car crash, and that was devastating. Um, and physically, I was actually okay, but mentally, it really took me out, uh, on top of all the other things I was managing at that time. So when I think about PTSD or trauma, it's not necessarily what happens because each person has a different level of resiliency and also a different level of capacity at different times in life. So when the crash happened, I was probably at one of my lowest points mentally and just like being able to cope. So as a therapist, I talk about window of tolerance, so our ability to um, regulate our nervous system and cope with the events that happen around us, make sense of it. So trauma is when there's too much going on that we don't have the capacity to make sense of it. So it's not necessarily what exactly happens, it's what else is happening and how can this person um, get through it? How do they feel? Do they feel like they're kind of trapped or stuck? And so that's what happened for me was this car crash. And then resolving that acute trauma after diagnosis was important. But my therapist and myself, we realized, oh, there's a lot of other triggers now that this kind of happened. And most of them are connected to medical situations and medical trauma. And that's how we kind of realized, oh, there's a bit more going on here. And that's when I kind of took a deep dive into treating trauma myself, like in my own therapy through EMDR. And that was really life-changing. And I then went on to kind of study that and how does this show up in other people's lives? Um, and so I got trained in EMDR, and now I provide that type of therapy to others.
And so you talked a little bit, I mean, on how that's helped you personally, like therapy, but how are you specifically now using these tools to help other people? And can you give me more information about these tools?
Yeah, so I think there's like different aspects of therapy and different things are right for different people. Um, so where I start with a lot of folks is about nervous system regulation, what's happening, how are you making sense of things? Are you in like a trauma state? So fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are three common ones. There's also flop. Oftentimes, we need to start with some coping skills and some regulation strategies. So, meeting the needs of the body and our psychological needs. So, feeling safe, connected with other humans. That's really important for all of us. So, often when I'm doing work with clients, I start there with help you like ground into your senses, help you to like have some coping skills. I utilize dialectical behavior therapy, which is one kind of like coping skills therapy. And then if they want to and if they're ready, then we also look at EMDR. Is this a good fit? Does this make sense for what you've gone through? Would this help you to process events from the past that were really difficult, traumatic, and help you to be more resilient? It's kind of like a phased approach. And so that's what I find most helpful when I'm working with people. And that's something that I've done myself and I see how it's paid off in my life.
So why do you think that medical providers often overlook or dismiss trauma in rheumatic disease patients?
Yeah, so I think this is really important, and I think there's three different reasons why medical providers might overlook medical trauma. Um, the first is because some of the procedures are inherently difficult, painful, and in medical treatment, we look at like life over limb. And so some of these things are just inherent to what has to happen in order to treat someone and keep them alive. Uh, and there is such a it's been so siloed between physical health care and mental health care. And I really think there needs to be more integration so that it's not so much of a that's not my problem kind of thing on the physical health side of things. The other piece is when people experience these events and it becomes a trauma for them, there's a tendency to blame the medical providers. And potentially, and sometimes that may be appropriate. But overall, it could simply be that these are painful things. We're not at our best when we experience them. And instead of blaming the providers, it's looking at, oh, this is a really tough thing to go through as a person. And so I wasn't able to cope well. I wasn't able to make sense of it. And if we can kind of get out of that blame game, that might help medical providers take some accountability for, hey, this thing is really challenging and I need to provide more support than just medication around it um, in the moment. And then I think the other thing about medical trauma is that not everyone experiences the same things as trauma. I kind of mentioned that earlier. So if I think of my own life and how things have gone with my medical care, IVs used to just be like a thing. I didn't love them. Who does? Uh, but they weren't traumatic. And since my most recent flares and dealing with PTSD, and I think I'm just harder to get an IV into now, um, I hate IVs, and they do cause panic attacks now, despite increased exposure. And that's because of what happens around it and just feeling really powerless when it's necessary. So not everyone's going to find an IV traumatic. I never used to, and yet now I do. And so how do I take care of myself in the midst of it? The final kind of aspect of why it's maybe overlooked is that providers on the physical health side aren't sure what we can do about medical trauma, right? So some of it, like I mentioned, is necessary. Some of the procedures are necessary, and they're not aware of how we can support people through it. So it's less traumatic, or if it is traumatic, how we help them kind of overcome and find resiliency. That we do have evidence-based trauma treatments, whether that's EMDR or cognitive processing or exposure therapy. We have so many different ways of working with trauma and helping people build back their resilience from it.
I want to talk a little bit about body image and chronic illness because I think these are all really important topics. We talked about medical trauma, but I think a big part of, being someone with a chronic illness is also, unfortunately, like other people do end up making comments about you. You get bullied, and you also feel insecure about your own body, perhaps because of side effects of medications or just things that are going on in general, and even, disordered eating. So,
Yeah.
these are topics that are under recognized for people with rheumatic disease. I feel like we don't talk a lot about body image or disordered eating. And why do you think that might be the case?
That's a really good question. It's a big one. I think there's different layers to it. Um, I don't want to throw my colleagues under the bus, but sometimes medical providers have their own biases about bigger bodies. And so when someone comes in and says, "Oh, my body's changed with, say, prednisone, I really want, it to be thinner again," doctors, nurses, they won't identify that as problematic because in their own minds, they would want that too, right? So that's a bias around body weight, shape, and size. And so they don't go further to find out what's this person doing to try to take back some control. Is it sustainable? Is it detrimental in any way? Is it becoming kind of obsessive? They just kind of stop the conversation too early due to their own kind of thoughts about bodies. I think that's changing slowly within all of our systems. There's more recognition of body positivity, body neutrality, health at every size. And we still have a long way to go. So there's that piece. I think there's also this element of people don't necessarily want to talk about what they're thinking or feeling. They feel some shame around acknowledging any kind of personal vanity. But we're in an image conscious world. If you think of how all of us kind of communicate day to day, it's a lot about how we look. Um, I'm raising an 11-year-old daughter. I saw when that awareness came in, and I can't say that she has a lot of access to media, but despite living in with a mom who has done eating disorders therapy for years and who really promotes healthy, active living and health at every size, it still comes up body worries. So I kind of see this as kind of inherent in our culture. Um, and so, of course, when you're dealing with your body going like for a lot, at least for vasculitis, it's really common to lose a bunch of weight. That's a symptom before you ever get diagnosis that you might lose weight or you might have issues with digesting food like I did. And there's so many things. And so you go from losing weight and your body changing and then maybe gaining it with treatment.
So, what would you say to someone listening who's silently struggling with food or their body because of their illness?
I think it's really important for people to kind of look up body neutrality and this idea that, our bodies are meant to get us through the world. It's fun to decorate them sometimes, but that's not the main purpose. Um, and so body neutrality is a great concept if it feels like body positivity is too far of a reach. Um, and also think about how you would support a friend who was struggling. If you wouldn't encourage them to do harmful things to themselves or restrict their food, then hopefully you can treat yourself with the same kind of self-compassion and kindness. Um, and also, if you are able, tell someone because shame is kind of at the root of body image stuff, and shame thrives in silence and hiding. So if you can kind of open up to someone you trust, it can help you get through it.
And what are the different options for patients, who might need to seek extra support for their mental health? Like, where can they go?
Right. So a lot of folks, the first point of contact will be their family doctor. And depending on where you live, for folks in Ontario, if your family doctor is part of a family health team or uh, a community health center, then you might have social work or psychotherapists available to you, no charge. Otherwise, you might be able to access psychotherapy through your employer, through your EAP program. And if not, you might have benefits to seek out a private psychotherapist, whether that's a social worker, a psychotherapist, psychologist. And so you can get the therapy that you need.
So there are lots of
Uh,
different options on, where people can go to get help that they might need that might be personal to their lived experience. But I think a lot of it comes down to also, your family doctor or your healthcare provider talking about the resources available in order for you to be able to then, get the help that you might need. So why is it important to have mental health clinicians who really understand chronic illness?
I think that sometimes the issues we face when we're dealing with chronic illness can be pathologized if mental health clinicians aren't aware of what it means to be immune suppressed, let's say. Like it would make sense that you're a bit more anxious about going out in public or about catching germs if you are dealing with like life with no immune system or a really vulnerable state. Also, the anxiety, the things that you might fixate on or worry about, can be unique to your disease and being able to monitor for symptoms and get help appropriately. And if that's pathologized, that's not helpful. I also think that like any mental health clinician, if they're interested in and willing to work with you, they can learn these things through consultation, whether that's with interprofessional colleagues or through specialized mental health providers who do take a deep focus on this. So as long as the provider is willing to find out and meet you where you are and show up to you, then you can get good care. Common treatment modalities like CBT or DBT, they can be adapted so that it makes sense to you dealing with your rheumatic condition or the symptoms that you're dealing with from your medications, anything like that, side effects.
And how can therapy be adapted for people living with long-term physical conditions? And, is therapy something that's like readily accessible and available to everyone? How does that work?
I think there in Ontario and across Canada, there are a lot of clinicians in private practice, and that fee for service model is a barrier to care for some folks. But if you are um, if you're working, if you have a workplace benefits, if you have an EAP, if you are in school, you can access counseling and mental health resources through your academic institution. And a lot of employers, when I worked at Starbucks, the reason I was able to start therapy was because I had benefits for therapy, and I thought, oh, try this out, it might help. So there are these different ways to access care. There's also lower cost, lower barrier services through group psychotherapy, um, through books like manuals you can work through on your own or utilize those in addition to seeing a therapist maybe once a month if you can't afford more than that. You can also ask about sliding scale so that you can access therapy more easily. But as far as like what's evidence-based, what can be adapted, I think most, like I was saying before, most of these modalities that we use commonly in psychotherapy, they can be adapted. They are reasonable. They are affordable if you're you want to work with someone who tells you what the plan is, how they're going to work with you, and how they're going to learn about your condition so that they can provide the appropriate support.
And then what are some signs that someone might need more specialized care beyond those coping strategies?
Beyond coping strategies, um, is when we're looking at like a more serious condition like PTSD, like I talked about my own journey with trauma therapy. Um, OCD also happens a fair bit, or eating disorders, like I mentioned. Um, and symptoms of these things um, are like rigidity or panic attacks, like I talked about, difficulty sleeping or eating, this ongoing sense of impending doom. So this idea, like just waiting for the shoe to drop, that's a sign of like kind of trauma brain showing up, getting in the way, and you don't have to live in that constant state if you're able to access appropriate therapy. And that might be more intensive than something like CBT. It might need to be a trauma-focused therapy that sees the illness overall as a trauma and helps you to cope with that through processing.
Are there other sort of like care strategies that people can use, if you decide not to go to therapy, but just kind of like taking care of yourself? Like, what are some tips and tricks that people can do in order to just better take care of themselves as well?
I always start with folks to find out how things are going with sleep, movement, and nutrition. And I start there with most clients because that is where symptoms will show up, but it's also kind of our baseline of what every single human needs in order to live. Um, and so if you're not able to meet those needs regularly, everything else becomes harder. It already adds a stress to your daily life. Then there's things like relaxation exercises, mindfulness or meditation, or any kind of reflection practice that can really help to just kind of take the edge off and kind of ground uh, so that you're not so anxious or you're not um, in a dysregulated state. Because when we're dysregulated, it's really hard to make effective choices. It's hard to connect with other people. And it isn't pleasant. Like it's uncomfortable.
It's hard to just like in general talk about all these topics like mental health and chronic illness. And so I just wanted to thank you for being so open and honest and transparent about everything that you've shared. I think a lot of people are definitely gonna learn a lot and take away. I know I will too. I feel like I've never known much about therapy and, the benefits and how it could help. And I know, you also attended our in-person event. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, your experience and, why you thought of coming on the podcast and talking about some of these topics, like I think it'd be great to share.
So yeah, it was so cool to attend this in-person event. I think I said at the event when I asked a question that like I'd been waiting for something like this for over 20 years since I was like a young person transitioning from pediatric care to adult care. And to get everyone in the room together, the care providers, researchers, patients, family members, and loved ones, and collaborate and share information back and forth. That really stood out to me that not only did the care providers come to present on their research or what they're doing in their clinics, they came to listen to each patient's story and what patients thought was important to address. And I really valued that in the experience, seeing that dialogue back and forth. So well done, and thank you so much for putting on this great event.
Thank you so much. I want to talk about, your vasculitis journey and the guidebook that you created called Navigating Your Vasculitis Journey, which also includes a course. Can you tell me a little bit about, this guidebook? What was your inspiration behind it? And, was there something specifically that was meaningful or difficult for you to write?
Yeah, so the guidebook came together actually during the pandemic when I was recovering from my latest flare and then was locked in my house with my family. And so I was using the time to write as kind of a way to just like show up for myself and to put something out there that I thought was missing in the conversation. Um, I just wanted to contribute in a meaningful way. And I thought that what I'd been through wasn't all that unique, actually. I thought probably other people have felt this way or have wondered these things. I got the inspiration for the guidebook from traveling. I've traveled a fair bit. It's a passion of mine. And I just thought it was ironic that you could learn every single thing about Paris where to eat, how to navigate the subway system, all of that. But there was nothing like that for living with a chronic health condition, at least that I was aware of. And I wanted to kind of create that guidebook that, okay, here are some things to do. You don't necessarily have to follow my itinerary or what I do to take care of myself, but here are different things to look at and consider that might be helpful.
And how has the response been from readers so far? Like any messages or feedback that you've gotten because of this guidebook?
Yeah, so we get most of the feedback from the guidebook through the course. And so the guidebook has actually evolved. I started trying to make it like a 40-page document. It's now like 140 pages. And that's all based on vasculitis patient feedback of what else they needed or thought should be in there. So by running the courses, it served as kind of a mini focus group, working our way through these different strategies and building on together. So every participant in the course has contributed to what the guidebook became or has become. And I just finished yesterday running the most recent cohort of the course. And I have to say, it flows really nicely now. Like I feel like it's in its final form, and it's really, we got great feedback from this latest cohort. We have gotten along. Um, and it's an opportunity for patients to connect with each other around this really rare disease. We've had patients from Canada, the UK, Italy, across the United States attend the courses and work through the guidebook. So I think it's serving a purpose, and that feels good.
And do you have any plans for this guidebook in the future? Like anything that you really want out of it in the future in upcoming years?
So I'm actually kind of adapting it so it's more generalized chronic illness. And so I think I've got through all the edits to kind of release that. And that's one of the things I'm going to make available through my practice. That's a lower cost. So it's going to be like a cost, like a paid product that you can get, like a PDF that's downloadable. So it's really accessible. It's like lower cost, but yeah, so it's something that anyone can access if they choose to.
It's so unique from someone like, living with the disease to also be able to create something like that and then lead it and have more people engaged in just the positive feedback. It just makes you feel like, you're doing a great job and that you're impacting lots of people. And I'm glad that people are really enjoying the work that you're doing. Is there anything else you'd like to share to our listeners today?
I just highlight how important these like events are, whether it's virtual or in person, of connecting with other patients who share a similar lived experience. For me, I didn't get that until like 2021 when I connected with the Vasculitis Foundation and other patient advocacy groups. And it has been so enriching. Like it has allowed me to feel like I'm under other people understand what I'm going through. And even though I've had amazing friends, family, my husband who've supported me, they don't get it at the same level. And so that's something I've appreciated by connecting more. And I would encourage anyone to do that, especially if you're feeling lonely or just like misunderstood.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for sharing your journey and insights with us today. Your story really shows how chronic illness affects not just the body, but also the mind, and why recognizing, medical trauma and mental health needs are so important. Your book, Navigating Your Vasculitis Journey, and your work provide hope and guidance to many people who feel unseen. So everyone make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this episode. Check out Stacey's social media channels and the links down below. And I'll see everyone next time on Take a Pain Check. Thank you so much, Stacey.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm so glad I could be here today.